guys, tonight we begin something soft, something strange, and something just a little too real. When you think of medieval Europe, what comes to mind? Maybe grand stone castles, noble knights on horseback, shimmering gowns flowing through candlelit halls, romantic weddings with roses chivalry, vows of love whispered beneath stained glass windows, yeah? Not quite, because here's the truth. Medieval marriage had less to do with love and more to do with livestock. Imagine this. You're 5 years old. You're outside playing with a stick that used to be a chicken. Suddenly your father comes out and says, "Good news. You're getting married to the baker's daughter. She owns half a goat." And that's it. That goat just determined your future. So the real question is, would you survive a social life where your wedding wasn't just your business, but everybody's, where who you married decided not just your status, but where you sat at dinner, or whether you could even attend dinner at all? Let's find out. No dating apps, no candlelit dinners, just family deals, scandalous soup, and someone's uncle watching you sleep on your wedding night. So before you get too comfy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and your current time in the comments. I want to see where and when you're watching from. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's begin at the very beginning, literally. You've just been born. Your head is barely the size of a turnip. You can't even hold up your neck, and someone somewhere is already planning your wedding. In the medieval world, marriage wasn't something you chose. It was something you were placed into like a spoon, into a bowl of questionable stew. From the moment your lungs took in that first gasp of stable-scented air, the clock was ticking. Not toward your first steps, not toward your first words, but toward your betrothal, a word that here means a very serious grown-up agreement made on your behalf before you've figured out how to blink properly. Let's say you're born into a peasant family. Your parents don't have much, just a patch of dirt, a couple of chickens, and maybe one particularly moody goat. Even so, your mother and father are already keeping an eye on that family. 2 cottages over the ones with a slightly bigger field, and a daughter who rumor has it didn't scream during her first bath. They're thinking, well, if our babies marry, maybe we can combine fields and finally build that fence we keep talking about. Now, if you're born into a noble family, will the stakes get higher? Much higher. Your family's land honor and future political leverage depend on who you're promised to. It's not about affection. It's not even about compatibility. It's about dowries, alliances, and how many oxen your father can squeeze out of the Earl of Wiltshire. Take, for example, a very real historical case. In 1137, Eleanor of Aquitaine arranged to marry off her daughter Marie at the age of 3 to a future count she had never met in a country she had never seen. Because what matters is not whether Marie likes soup or is afraid of the dark. What matters is land, titles, and whether the new in-laws have enough vineyards to justify calling the marriage a strategic move. Of course, you, the toddler in this scenario, don't know any of this. You're just busy chewing on a wooden spoon and making odd noises that scare the family cat. Meanwhile, 2 fathers are sitting at a bench under a tree shaking hands over your future. And they're saying things like, "Your Thomas has strong teeth. My Matilda has strong ankles. I think they'll do just fine together." And that's it. You're now spoken for. Even though you won't even meet your future spouse until you both develop neck strength. In many cases, a formal document was drawn up, a betrothal contract. It outlined what each family was giving, how much land or livestock was involved, and what penalties would be paid if the agreement was broken. And this wasn't taken lightly. Breaking a betrothal could result in social shame, excommunication, or someone throwing leeks at your front door. Not kidding. It was a thing. Now let's pause for a second. Imagine being told today that your love life was determined by your parents talking over bread and weak ale one cold spring afternoon. No, do you like hiking? What's your Hogwarts house? Just, their father owns 4 pigs. Ours owns 3. Time to make it 5.5. If you were lucky, you might be betrothed at the age of 7 or 8. If you were unlucky, that number dropped significantly. There are church records in parts of England noting betrothal contracts signed for babies not yet weaned, which led to some very awkward play dates where both babies were in diapers and technically already engaged. But why all this rush? Because marriage wasn't just about 2 people, it was about 2 families, 2 sets of land resources, reputations, alliances, and obligations. It was a merger, a treaty, a peace agreement sometimes brokered with meat pies and promises of you can have the eastern orchard when I die. And here's the twist. Even before the wedding ever happened, being betrothed already changed your social life. You might be 7, but now you're expected to act with dignity because your future mother-in-law might be watching. You couldn't flirt, you couldn't run around barefoot in the mud. Okay, well, maybe you still did, but people gossiped. And your name was now often said in the same breath as your intendeds, as in, that's young Richard. He's betrothed to that girl with the mole on her eyebrow. You know, the one whose uncle fell into a well. You were no longer just you. You were part of a plan. And woe unto you if you started to develop other ideas, like maybe you liked the blacksmith's son or thought the miller's apprentice had nice hair, because emotional preferences were not part of the equation. If anything, they were considered dangerous distractions. Love, after all, was not the foundation of good marriages. Pigs were. Still, there were moments, tiny quiet ones, when children caught in these arrangements tried to make the best of it. Some betrothed pairs actually played together, grew up in each other's company, and became genuine friends. Some even whispers liked each other, but most were strangers until they weren't. And by the time the actual wedding came around, sometimes years later, you'd simply nod and say, "Oh, you're the one my parents picked when I was teething on a spoon." So the next time someone complains about online dating being awkward, just remember, at least you weren't promised to someone based on how many chickens your father could count on a foggy Tuesday. So let's imagine you're a little older now. Maybe 12, maybe 15, if your parents were generous with time. You've long since accepted that your fate is tied to someone you barely know, or perhaps have only seen while they were crying about being forced to eat turnip porridge. But now comes the next big step, courtship. Except, this isn't your modern candlelit dinner stroll by the river, maybe a clumsy poem under the stars. Nope. In the medieval world, courtship was a lot like buying a second-hand plow. You check the land, you check the tools, you check the family cow. If she looks nervous, something's wrong. It was less about wooing the person and more about evaluating the package. What land comes with them? How many chickens? Are the fences in decent shape also? Can she spin wool? Can she bake bread? Can she survive childbirth without summoning the entire village for help? In rural villages, this process involved long, incredibly practical visits. Not romantic, not spontaneous, just methodical. You'd arrive at the home of your future in-laws, remove your muddy boots, or not depending on your class, and sit on a wobbly stool while her father offered you weak ale and stared deeply into your soul. Meanwhile, the mother was quietly observing your shoulders to judge your ox handling potential, and the bride-to-be was nervously adjusting her apron, praying you weren't the one with the boil on your nose everyone had been whispering about. And what about you? Well, you weren't looking at her eyes. You were looking at the shelves, at the grain sacks, at the quality of the thatch roof. Because in this economy, love was nice, but oats were better. If you were a bit higher up the social ladder, say a merchant's son or daughter, the process got even more formal. There might be official gift exchanges, a bolt of linen, a hand-forged belt buckle, a particularly fine goose. Sometimes a symbolic gesture was made, like giving the girl a pair of gloves, not because she was cold, but because gloves were expensive and represented commitment. And also, let's be honest, because nothing says romance like sheep leather wrapped around fingers. But let's not forget the test dinners. Yes, that was a thing. Families would invite the potential spouse over for supper, not to talk feelings, but to test skills. Could she cook? Could he carve meat without flinging it across the room? Was the soup salted properly? Or was it more of a punishment broth? In one recorded example from a village in 13th century Flanders, a suitor was rejected because he salted the porridge before tasting it. That's right. He was seen as impulsive, reckless, possibly dangerous. A man who doesn't know his oats clearly can't manage a household. On the flip side, if a woman burned the bread, or worse, used too much yeast, she might be seen as wasteful or prideful. One step away from sin, one step away from scandal. A bride who can't knead dough was seen as someone who'd never properly submit to the natural order of things. And speaking of submission, the entire courtship process had layers of unspoken rules. For instance, you were not supposed to smile too much. Smiling implied vanity. You were also not supposed to be too quiet because that implied passivity. But you absolutely could not be assertive either because that would scare the elders. So what did that leave you with? A delicate middle ground where you had to seem agreeable, modest, clever, pious, hardworking, not too pretty, that made people jealous but not too plain, that worried people, and somehow fertile looking. Yes, fertility was a silent but constant presence. You might be 14, but your hips were already being evaluated. Aunties would nudge each other and whisper, "She's got birthing hips, that one." Like her grandmother. Popped out twins and went right back to stirring stew. And if you were a man, your hands were inspected. Calloused, hardworking, too clean, lazy, too many rings, vain. Not enough rings, poor. Let's also talk about gifts. In wealthier circles, suitors often had to present tokens not to the girl but to her father. You weren't wooing her heart. You were wooing his ledger. A wine barrel, a new saddle, sometimes even a donation to the local church in his name. One man in Normandy once offered a painted wooden crucifix and a live goose. The crucifix was a nice touch. The goose laid an egg on the father's shoe. He still got married. Goose blessings were seen as a good omen? No, really. Now imagine this entire awkward performance happening in a cramped, smoky cottage with 3 children crying a dog, licking something suspicious in the corner, and someone's grandfather snoring in the back room. Romance. Not exactly, but this was serious business. Because marriage was survival. It was your only ladder up or your fastest way down. If your future husband had a thriving cabbage patch and decent teeth, you might never go hungry. If your future wife had 3 healthy brothers, you had a guaranteed work crew for harvest season. And if their family had good standing with the local priest, well, then your children's baptisms would come with extra blessings and maybe a free candle. Let's not forget the social peacocking. If you were a particularly attractive prospect, your parents might hold a little open house. Yes, a medieval version of The Bachelor. Young men would come visit. They'd lift heavy sacks, casually flex near the well, and talk loudly about how many cartloads of hay they'd personally stacked last season. Girls would be brought in to help serve ale, show off embroidery, or play a lute badly but enthusiastically. And through it all, parents would hover like auctioneers. She's never been sick a day in her life. His aunt is cousins with a bishop. She can make 3 kinds of porridge and doesn't cry when plucking chickens. The truth is, every meeting, every glance, every bowl of soup was part of the process. And if everything aligned, the land, the tools, the temperament, the teeth, you might just be permitted to start calling each other intended, which in medieval terms meant, I have examined your turnips and found them acceptable. I have observed your roof doesn't leak. I will allow it. And that was love, or at least the closest thing most people got to it. Let's say everything's gone according to plan. The goat was acceptable. The soup wasn't too salty. The grandmother didn't curse your name in Latin. A match has been made. Congratulations. You are now on the official path toward becoming married. But hold on, this isn't just a personal milestone. It's a public declaration of status. Because in the medieval world, who you married didn't just define your home life. It defined your social life down to where you sat, who you spoke to, and even how loudly you were allowed to laugh at a feast. Let's unpack this slowly. Picture a medieval village square, muddy, a little chaotic, with the faint smell of boiled cabbage in the air. Now imagine there's a local feast being held in the Lord's courtyard. Everyone is invited, sort of, but where you sit and whether you even get to sit is entirely based on your marital alliance. Married into a respected family with land status or connections to the clergy, you'll be seated closer to the roasted boar, near the fire, with a real wooden spoon and maybe even a cushion under your behind. Married the wrong person. You'll be out in the cold next to the man who eats onions like apples and hasn't bathed since Pentecost. Because make no mistake, your marriage was your ticket to social standing. Let's look at the social ladder for a moment. At the bottom, you had landless laborers, people who basically rented their dignity in exchange for survival. Above them were peasants with small plots of land, then merchants and tradesmen, blacksmiths, weavers, millers, then minor nobles, knights, stewards, clergy, and finally the landed aristocracy. Now here's the thing, you could climb this ladder, but almost never by yourself. You climbed it through marriage. Let's say your family owns a modest bakery. You have flour, firewood, and a reputation for decent rye bread. But you want more. Your mother hears that the daughter of the town's cooper, that's a barrel maker, is available, and her father just bought a second cow. Boom. Negotiations begin. Because if that marriage goes through, you're no longer just a baker. You're related to a man with livestock. And in the social math of the medieval world, that's a significant upgrade. Suddenly you're invited to harvest festivals you weren't cool enough for before. People say hello to you with slightly less suspicion. You're offered the good corner at church near the front where the air smells like old books instead of wet wool. And what about the reverse? What if you marry down? Well, things get tricky. Let's say your daughter was supposed to marry the son of a spice merchant A very good match, by the way. But she goes rogue. She falls for a wandering fiddler with no land, no livestock, and a suspicious relationship with his flute. Suddenly, invitations stop arriving. Neighbors stop loaning you sugar. Your name disappears from the guild's party list. Why? Because marriage was a statement and marrying poorly sent a message to the entire village. We no longer care about the rules or potatoes. One particularly awkward consequence of this was the system of tiered seating. At feasts, weddings, and even funerals, you were placed according to marital merit. There's a recorded incident in 14th century York where a blacksmith's wife was seated one bench too close to the noble's table, and a full argument broke out over her husband's in-laws' cheese business. Yes, cheese caused a class scandal because his new brother-in-law had been accused of watering down sheep's milk, which in turn made the marriage alliance suspicious. Now let's talk about churches. Churches were sacred spaces, but they were also status arenas. Your marriage determined whether you got a real pew or had to stand near the door with the goats. Some wealthier families even built private chapels onto their homes, miniature shrines to both God and their superior taste in in-laws. Getting married into a clergy-connected family gave you spiritual bonus points. People assumed you were more pious even if you still occasionally kicked your boots off and cursed at chickens. There were even regional rules about marriage dowry tiers. A woman who brought a land parcel into the marriage could elevate her husband's social rank, especially if that land had trees. Trees meant wood. Wood meant power. One medieval document from 1312 lists the dowry of a merchant's daughter as 2 goats, a silver comb, and full grazing rights to the eastern hedgerow. After the marriage, her husband was allowed to speak directly to the town reeve without bowing first. A small change, but one that came with immense pride. Now here's a detail. I love the wedding gifts. Not the ones you got, those were usually onions and small amounts of butter. No, I'm talking about the gifts you gave to the community to announce your new status. Newly married couples often offered ale to the villagers or held bread feasts. It wasn't generous, it was strategic. If your marriage was upwardly mobile, you wanted everyone to know it. What better way than to distribute warm bread and say, "Yes, I did marry the daughter of the man who owns half the grain field. Please enjoy this slightly burnt roll." But this went both ways. If your marriage was disappointing, people expected you to lay low. No feasts, no songs, just quiet shame and awkward nods. Some couples even faked social elevation, renting fine clothes, borrowing silverware, and acting just fancy enough to confuse their neighbors into reevaluating their ranking. In one case, a couple in Sussex borrowed a priest's chair just for their post-wedding meal, making guests believe they had ecclesiastical connections. It worked for about a week. Then someone spotted them eating porridge with spoons made from dried gourd, and the illusion crumbled. All of this might sound exhausting, and it was. But for medieval people, this was just life. Marriage was how you moved. Not through talent, not through ambition, through alliances, through names, through goats and gloves and gossip. Even your children's future depended on your marital status. If you married well, your kids might go to monastery school. If not, they'd end up herding sheep or, worse, singing for coins in the marketplace. And so people took it seriously. Because it wasn't about romance, it was about access to land, to food, to opportunity, and most importantly, to the right bench. Now that you've found a match, secured approval from your families, and possibly thrown a mildly impressive bread feast, there's just one more obstacle standing between you an official, legitimate, medieval matrimony. The church. Ah, yes, that towering institution of incense chanting and suspiciously well-fed monks. If marriage was the social ladder, then the church was the grumpy doorman holding the clipboard. Because here's the thing, while your parents, neighbors, and livestock might all agree that you're ready to wed, none of it counted unless the church said so. And the church had rules. So, many rules. Let's start with one of the most important, consanguinity. A fancy word that basically meant you can't marry your cousin, or your cousin's cousin, or even that guy whose grandmother once shared a donkey with your great-aunt's uncle. In the 12th century, the Catholic Church prohibited marriage within 7 degrees of kinship. 7. Let that sink in. We're talking extended family trees, so tangled, they needed their own arborists. And because most medieval villages had a population smaller than your local bowling alley, this rule essentially outlawed half the available dating pool, which meant you'd often find yourself squinting at your beloved and asking questions like, wait, was your grandmother's brother's wife's cousin once married to my great-uncle's niece? Guess we'd better go ask Father Bernard. And ask you would, because every marriage required church approval sometimes. In the form of a banns, a public announcement read aloud in church for 3 Sundays before the wedding. This was to give the community time to raise objections. And raise objections they did. Anything from they're too closely related to he once sneezed during Lent could halt your nuptials in their tracks. The bans weren't just about checking family trees, they were about making sure your souls were compatible and that no one was already married to someone else, which awkwardly happened more than you'd think. Bigamy was a problem in the medieval world. People moved, people lied. Records were inconsistent at best, and if you accidentally married 2 people, well, the church would help sort that out. Usually by yelling, fining, and making everyone wear sackcloth. Now let's say you passed all the tests. Your families weren't related. Your banns were clean. You hadn't married anyone else in secret while drunk on mead. Congratulations, you could now proceed to the wedding ceremony. Which brings us to one of the strangest parts of medieval marriage public bedding ceremonies. Yes. That's exactly what it sounds like. The church and sometimes the village would want proof that the marriage had been, let's say, consummated, because without that, the whole thing didn't really count. Imagine you've just sat through an exhausting day of formal vows, roasted meats, and relatives singing off-key. You're finally led to your new shared bed, and there, standing by the door, is Father Thomas, and maybe a few uncles, and a cousin, and your mother-in-law with a candle, and a knowing smile. All of them standing there to witness your first night as a married couple. Not to watch anything indecent, let's be clear. Their job was simply to witness that you were both in the bed at the same time. Some even required the couple to strip down to their shifts, underwear-like garments, and be tucked in by relatives like children being put to sleep after a long fare. The symbolism was important. It proved that you were serious. It proved that the marriage was real. And in some ways it invited the entire community into your private life, which was very on brand for the medieval era. Now, of course, not every couple had a public bedding. Some did it privately, with only the priest's assurance. Others skipped it entirely and hoped no one noticed. But if your family was particularly proud or wealthy, they might go all out throwing a small bedding feast, complete with songs, drinks, and awkward toasts, like, to the happy couple, may your loins be fruitful and your goat pen ever full. Moving on. Once married, the church still held significant control over your relationship. If you and your spouse began to argue, or worse, wanted to separate, you couldn't just walk away. Marriage was indissoluble. That's a fancy word for you're stuck. The church didn't recognize divorce. They recognized annulment, which basically meant the marriage had never been valid in the first place. To get one, you had to prove that one of you was already married, that you were secretly related, that you were underage, or that you had never, done the bedding part. Otherwise, you stayed together. Even if you hated each other. Even if your husband chewed turnips with his mouth open and refused to bathe. Even if your wife threw cabbages at you and named all the chickens after her exes, you were married. In the eyes of the church, that meant forever. There were, of course, exceptions. Some couples were granted separation from bed and board, a legal form of permanent separation, where they could live apart but not remarry. You were legally apart, but spiritually still tied together. Think of it as the medieval version of "it's complicated." The church also held strong opinions on how couples should treat one another. Husbands were expected to provide and protect. Wives were expected to obey and honor. Mutual respect was preached, though often unevenly applied. If a husband beat his wife excessively, he might face penance. If a wife disobeyed her husband, she might also face penance. And yes, sometimes penance meant being made to walk barefoot in public while reciting psalms. So there's that. The church's teachings extended into the bedroom as well. They had long lists of acceptable behaviors, positions, and times for intimacy. Spoiler, most of them were no. You couldn't be intimate on Sundays, or Fridays, or during Lent, or Advent, or Easter week, or while fasting, or when a saint's day was near. By some estimates, only about 90 days per year were considered acceptable for marital fun, which might explain why so many couples just focused on making bread instead. But despite all the rules, regulations, and robed observers, many medieval couples made it work. They laughed, they raised children, they shared hardship and joy, they gossiped, they aged, they buried parents, and planted barley. They didn't always love each other, but many did. And even when they didn't, they knew that marriage was the skeleton key to medieval life. With it, you had structure. Without it, you were floating in a very judgmental sea. So yes, the church watched. They lectured, they announced, they occasionally showed up at the foot of your bed holding a candle, but they also gave your marriage meaning, a structure, a shared vocabulary, and for better or worse, a very, very large audience. So, you've been matched, evaluated, approved by the church, and publicly tucked into bed. At last, it's time for the big day. The wedding, the ceremony, the moment where two souls are united and at least one sheep is sacrificed to bless the soup. But forget everything you think you know about weddings. There were no puffy white dresses, no tiered cakes, no slow dances under twinkle lights or awkward best man speeches that go a little too far. In the medieval world, a wedding wasn't a fairy tale. It was logistics, informal wear, with a few questionable pies thrown in. Let's start with the dress. Contrary to modern myth, brides didn't wear white. They wore whatever they had that wasn't currently covered in ash goat hair or stew. If you were rich, you wore bright colors, reds, golds, deep greens, because dye was expensive, and nothing said wealth like not blending in with the mud. In fact, blue was a popular choice because it represented purity and devotion, especially if your name wasn't yet associated with any fishy behavior near the grain mill. One noblewoman in 14th century Burgundy is recorded to have worn a deep blue velvet gown lined with squirrel fur. Romantic, perhaps. But the poor girl fainted halfway through the ceremony because squirrel fur is very warm in June. Now, if you were a peasant, you might wear a simple linen dress cleaned as best as possible, and perhaps adorned with a belt flowers or borrowed brooches. The goal wasn't elegance. The goal was not to smell like livestock for at least a few hours. And for grooms, they wore their best tunic, usually with some form of embroidery, ideally not from their mother, unless they wanted to be teased for eternity. In some regions, the groom also carried a small knife tucked into his belt, not for defense, but for symbolism, to show he could cut through hardship or carve out a life, or maybe just cut bread. Symbolism was flexible. Now let's talk location. Most weddings didn't happen inside churches. That's right, they happened on the church steps. Why? Because marriage was considered a public sacrament. It had to be witnessed by the community. And the steps were the perfect in-between space, holy enough to count, but outdoors enough to fit the whole village, including the drunk uncle, who always sang during serious moments. The priest would lead the ceremony in Latin, even if no one understood Latin. There'd be blessings, exchanges of tokens like rings, gloves, or sometimes a loaf of bread, and the all-important hand-fasting ritual where the couple's hands were literally tied together with a ribbon or cloth to represent their new bond. Yes, that's where the phrase tying the knot comes from. Now, once the vows were said and the knot tied, it was time to party. And by party we mean consume alarming amounts of meat ale and something vaguely resembling a pie. Medieval wedding feasts were a strange combination of rustic charm and gastrointestinal challenge. If you were lucky enough to have some wealth, your wedding table might include roasted pig with apples in its mouth, which no one ever ate, spiced pottage, a thick soup that could contain anything from turnips to leftover goose black bread, dense, chewy, and mildly weaponizable. Hard cheese, so hard it had to be cut with an axe. And if you were really lucky, a bit of honeyed almond paste. For dessert, there were no layered wedding cakes. Instead, you might get a bride's pie, a round pastry filled with meat leeks and possibly a hard-boiled egg. It was not sweet, it was not photogenic, but it was traditional. One 15th century account mentions a wedding in Devon where the bride's pie included a live bird inside. When cut open, the bird flew out, symbolizing joy, new life, and giving everyone at the table a mild heart attack. And the ale flowed freely, so freely that many weddings ended not with dancing, but with someone falling asleep in a turnip cart. And if you were high status, you might even get a minstrel, a traveling musician, who would sing songs about love, fate, and possibly someone's embarrassing incident with a goose last spring. Of course there were games. One common wedding game involved the guests chasing the groom around the village square with sticks until he surrendered a coin or a shoe. Another required the bride to identify her new husband while blindfolded simply by touching his hands, which could go wrong very quickly if your cousin Hubert was nearby and had equally calloused thumbs. And then there was the tradition of throwing wheat at the newlyweds, not rice. Wheat symbolized fertility. Sometimes if people were in a particularly festive mood, they'd throw whole loaves. There's a story of a baker's daughter in Kent whose wedding ended with her dodging a flying rye roll from her own grandmother. Now all this merrymaking had rules. Feasts had to be done before sundown, unless you were very rich. Dancing was encouraged, but nothing too suggestive like spinning in circles or showing an ankle. And speaking of ankles, there's a delightful and mildly odd tradition from Wales where after the wedding, the bride's stockings would be removed and thrown behind her back into a group of unmarried women. Whoever caught one was next to marry. Yes, it's like a bouquet toss, except used hosiery. But perhaps the strangest tradition was the one where the bride and groom would be led to their new home or room by a procession of friends and relatives carrying candles and singing awkward rhymes. Imagine walking hand in hand with your new spouse while your aunt belts out a half-rhyming chant about plump children and sturdy shoes. Once you arrived at the threshold, the groom was expected to carry the bride over it, not because of superstition, but because sometimes the floors were muddy and no one wanted to ruin the one clean dress in town. There was often a symbolic bread-breaking moment where the couple shared a crusty loaf and sometimes fed a piece to the fire as an offering. And then, as we've covered in the last section, the bedding ceremony began. Except now, after a day of eating, singing, and smiling, awkwardly at people you barely knew, you were expected to climb into bed with the same person you just saw spill gravy on themselves. And if all went well, meaning no chickens interrupted and no one snored too early, you'd fall asleep next to your legally recognized spouse, probably in a shared room with at least one other relative nearby. Because privacy, that's a luxury for the future. So yes, medieval weddings weren't about fairy lights or diamond rings. They were about alliances, food, fertility, and surviving the day without vomiting on a monk. But in their own way, they were meaningful. Because every song, every loaf, every awkward pie filled with questionable meat was a signal to the community. These two are now bound by law, by faith, and by the slightly greasy ribbon tied around their wrists. And for all their quirks, these weddings set the stage for everything that followed: family, land, reputation, survival. Not just for the couple, but for everyone around them. So the feast is done. The last crumbs of hard cheese have been swept away. The minstrels are packing up their lutes, the torches are sputtering low, and your new spouse is looking at you like they're not entirely sure how to breathe. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice calls out, "Time for the bedding." Everyone cheers. You panic. Because the bedding ceremony, a term that sounds mildly romantic, was really just medieval code for let's all walk this poor couple to bed and make things as awkward as humanly possible. In many parts of medieval Europe, the bedding wasn't a private affair. It was a community event, loud, chaotic, and full of clapping. Let's paint the picture. You and your new spouse are led from the feast hall to the marriage bed. You don't go alone. You're accompanied by family, friends, drunk uncles, and, depending on the region, a village pig named after a saint. People are singing, people are throwing petals, or sometimes barley. Someone is playing a flute, slightly off key. And then, when you reach your destination, a simple bed, maybe in a loft or a private room if you're lucky, it's time for the real ritual to begin. The undressing. No, not like that. You don't undress yourselves. You're undressed by your guests. That's right. It was tradition for friends and relatives to help remove your wedding clothes, gently and symbolically, of course. They'd untie ribbons, loosen belts, maybe even fold your sleeves like they were packing you for spiritual shipment. This was done partly in jest, partly in ritual. It represented a community's support of the marriage, a way of saying, we helped you get dressed today. We'll help you build a life tomorrow. Still, it must have been excruciating, especially when your cousin kept giggling every time he saw an ankle. Once you were down to your shift, a sort of linen nightgown, you were helped into bed. Yes, helped. Some couples were literally tucked in like children. Others were seated side by side and offered a ceremonial drink, ale milk or spiced wine. A toast was made. The priest, if still present, might mutter a quick blessing and promptly exit, unless he was the kind who lingered, holding a candle and looking meaningfully at the sheets. There were regional variations. In Scotland, guests sometimes tossed coins or fruit onto the bed for fertility. In parts of Germany, a loaf of bread was placed beneath the pillows to ensure prosperity. In Wales, guests would write silly verses and read them aloud while the couple pretended not to exist. And yes, sometimes, especially in noble households, witnesses were required. Not to observe anything scandalous, but simply to ensure the marriage had been sealed. In one bizarre English account, 2 monks stood silently outside the bedroom door, waiting to hear, well, a sound, any sound, preferably one that indicated something was happening. One can imagine the pressure. Are we being loud enough? Is coughing acceptable? The idea behind this wasn't to shame, but to confirm. A consummated marriage was legally stronger. It meant land deals were locked in, inheritances, secured reputations preserved. Without that final step, a marriage could be challenged by family neighbors or opportunistic bishops with too much parchment on their hands. In peasant homes where privacy was a luxury, the newlyweds might share a room with younger siblings, grandparents, or even livestock nearby. Curtains were rare. Soundproofing was non-existent. Romance was hopeful. But somehow in all this absurdity, real bonds were formed. Couples laughed. Some whispered shyly beneath wool blankets. Some cried. Some promptly fell asleep from exhaustion and too much pottage. What mattered wasn't passion. It was presence. You were now officially together through awkward songs, flying barley and all. The next morning things didn't get much less strange. In some areas, guests returned to the bedchamber to deliver breakfast, usually porridge or bread, with honey, and check on the couple's mood. This was called the morning greeting, and yes, it often involved intrusive questions about sleep quality and general satisfaction. In noble households, a sheet might be presented as proof of consummation, especially if property or royal inheritance depended on it. Sometimes a small token like a belt or ribbon was handed to the bride's family, symbolizing the completion of the marriage. But for most couples, the morning after meant getting up, dressing quickly, and returning to work. Because pigs needed feeding. Bread needed kneading. And someone had to clean up the mess from last night's pie-throwing incident. In a way, this abrupt return to reality was the message marriage wasn't a magical escape. It was another beginning. Wrapped in wool, witnessed by a dozen relatives and serenaded by slightly drunk flute players, still many couples remembered their bedding night with fondness. Not for its romance, but for its community. The people who helped them get there. The rituals that reminded them they weren't doing this alone. And let's be honest, there's something oddly comforting about being ceremonially tucked in while your aunt hums a hymn about fruitful loins. So the next time you slip under your modern duvet in a private room with dim lighting and no relatives peering through the door, spare a thought for those medieval newlyweds, wrapped in scratchy linen surrounded by singing villagers, hoping the goat doesn't wander in again. Because that, dear listener, was the first night of the rest of their lives. Softly lit, slightly awkward, and profoundly medieval. So you survived the wedding feast. You survived the barley throwing, the squirrel fur gown, the loaf-filled pie, and the slightly too enthusiastic wedding ceremony. Now it's the morning after, and you're officially married. You stretch, you yawn, you reach for the bread left on the table beside the bed. And just like that, your entire life has changed. Because for a medieval woman, marriage wasn't just about starting a family. It was about losing things. Let's start with the big one property. The moment you said I do, or rather, yes, with God's blessing, your possessions became your husband's. Your cows his, your land his, your heirloom wooden spoon with the carved goose handle also his. Even if you brought a dowry into the marriage, that too was transferred into his hands. This wasn't theft. It was the law, and it was called coverture, a charming little system where your legal identity was essentially absorbed, like a medieval version of a software update you didn't agree to. Before marriage, you were a person. After marriage, you were the wife of someone, not a separate legal entity, not someone who could sign contracts or file complaints, just a very involved dependent. You couldn't own land, you couldn't sue or be sued. In many cases, you couldn't even testify in court without your husband's permission. Unless, of course, you were testifying against witches. In that case, everyone wanted to hear from you. Let's say you were running a small ale brewing business before marriage. You had regular customers, a good reputation, a clay mug you were particularly proud of. You marry a man who's a thatcher, and suddenly your business is his on paper. You're still brewing the ale, of course, still scrubbing the kettles, serving the customers, and chasing chickens out of the brewing shed, but any profits now belong to him, because that's how the world worked. Of course, in practice, many women continued to manage their businesses. Some even expanded them, especially if their husbands were too busy or too useless to interfere. But the legal recognition, that was gone. Then there's the matter of obedience. Marriage vows weren't about romance, they were about hierarchy. You, as the wife, promised to obey. He, as the husband, promised to protect. It sounded like a fair trade until you realized that protect sometimes meant control. Want to visit your sister in the next village? Better ask permission. Want to buy a bolt of wool for weaving? Better hope he's feeling generous. Want to eat the good cheese instead of saving it for guests? Well, now you're just being selfish. In some regions, husbands even had the legal right to discipline their wives. This could range from stern words to, yes, physical punishment. Now there were limits. You couldn't beat your wife with an object thicker than your thumb, hence the mythical rule of thumb. But still, the fact that such distinctions existed says a lot. Fortunately, not every man was a tyrant. Plenty of marriages were partnerships, quiet, respectful, and full of mutual eye-rolling over that one neighbor who never tied up his goats. But the expectation was clear. The man led, the woman followed. Even in church, married women were seated behind their husbands. Their hair had to be covered, their voices softened, their opinions filtered through the lens of humility. There's a famous medieval proverb, "A silent wife is a gift from God," which sounds less like a blessing and more like something a man with a black eye once carved into a doorframe. Now let's talk about childbearing. Once married, a woman's primary role was to produce heirs, healthy children, preferably boys, and the sooner the better. No pressure, of course, just your entire social value tied to your womb. The average medieval woman might have 5 to 7 children depending on her health status and access to midwives who didn't believe in leeches. Pregnancy was constant, childbirth was dangerous, and recovery time was optimistic. There are records of women returning to work in the fields, within days of giving birth. One chronicler notes a wife who, after delivering twins in the morning, was seen grinding grain by sunset. Heroic, yes. Also mildly horrifying. And yet, despite all these hardships, women found power where they could. In the home, they controlled the rhythm of daily life, cooking, weaving, teaching children, making soap, brewing ale, and occasionally stopping their husbands from burning down the shed during a project. Older women, especially widows, could gain real influence. Once the husband was gone and his relatives had taken their cut, a widow could manage property, run businesses, and even mentor younger women in the village. There are records of widows serving as midwives, healers, innkeepers, scribes, and even tax collectors. Because once you've survived childbirth, raised 6 children, and negotiated with 3 bakers during a flour shortage, there's not much that scares you. Some wives were known to use coded language, in public humble, on the surface, but with sharp edges. One woman reportedly described her husband as a man of few words and fewer socks. Another referred to hers as well-meaning, in the sense that cows are well-meaning when they stand in your cabbage patch. So yes, medieval marriage was limiting. It was legalistic. It was often deeply unfair. But women found ways to navigate it, to whisper behind veils, to lead while appearing to follow, to teach daughters when no one was looking, to turn quiet corners of the world into small empires of dough, soap, and stubborn dignity. Because even in a world that didn't always recognize them, medieval wives lived vivid, complicated lives. And maybe one of them is smiling down from a medieval manuscript, somewhere ink-stained fingers, knowing grin, muttering, "I was more than just someone's wife. I was the reason he ate, survived, and didn't accidentally poison himself with mushrooms." And if that's not power, I don't know what is. Let's shift focus for a moment. Because as much as medieval women were placed into rigid boxes after marriage, well, so were the men. Different boxes, sure. Slightly better decorated, maybe. But boxes all the same. Marriage for a medieval man wasn't a license to do whatever he pleased. It was a package deal. You got a wife, maybe some goats, perhaps an extra field to plow, and in return you received a long and complicated list of new responsibilities, some noble, some weird, some that involved public foot washing. Let's begin with the obvious providing. A husband's role was first and foremost that of a provider. Food, shelter, clothing. If the fire went out, if the roof leaked, if the butter ran thin, people didn't blame the weather. They blamed him. Even if his wife was the one actually doing the milking, the spinning, the budgeting, he was expected to ensure the household didn't collapse into a hungry puddle of shame and moldy pottage. In some communities, if a married man failed to provide adequately, he could be publicly shamed. We're talking stocks, fines, sermons, or even being paraded through town with a sign reading, "This man's wife had to borrow onions." But it wasn't just about onions. Men were legally and morally tied to their wives' behavior. Which brings us to one of the most absurd features of medieval marital life: shared punishment. That's right. If your wife stole a chicken, you could be punished with her, sometimes instead of her, because you as her husband were considered responsible for her soul, her actions, and occasionally her taste in poultry. This was based on the idea that a man was the spiritual head of the household. If his wife misbehaved, it must mean he had failed in his divine duties of supervision and instruction. One 13th century account from northern France describes a man being fined after his wife was caught throwing rotten fish at a merchant who refused to barter. The court determined that he should have taught her better manners. And when a woman was put on trial, her husband was often expected to stand beside her literally and figuratively. He might be questioned. He might be required to pay damages. He might even be punished alongside her as a lesson to others. It didn't always matter if he knew what she did. If she broke a window in rage, if she insulted a priest during a market argument, if she spilled ale on a tax record because the table was crooked, he was still involved. Because marriage was a unit, and units shared the credit and the blame. Now, of course, this principle worked in reverse. Sometimes, if a husband committed a minor offense, a well-respected wife could occasionally intercede on his behalf. She might plead for leniency. She might offer restitution in kind breadcloth labor. There are tales of women defending their husbands in court arms, folded tone polite but firm. Yes, Your Honor. He did say the bishop's mule had uneven legs, but he was very tired and the soup was burnt. But back to the husbands. Aside from punishment, many married men were also expected to perform symbolic duties that made marriage feel less like romance and more like performance art. For instance, in some English villages, it was customary for the husband to wash his wife's feet every Saturday evening, not as an act of submission, but as a reminder of humility and service. He'd heat the water gently, rinse her feet, dry them with linen, and sometimes kiss them, all while reciting a psalm or humming something vaguely church-like. It was equal parts spiritual, awkward, and probably kind of sweet. In other regions, the husband was expected to cut his wife's bread at every meal. Again, not a romantic gesture. It was symbolic of his role as provider of sustenance. One man in 14th century Bavaria was ridiculed for failing to cut his wife's bread at a feast. The priest allegedly whispered, "If he cannot serve bread, how can he serve the Lord dramatic much?" Now let's not forget emotional labor. Yes, even medieval men were expected to demonstrate affection, at least publicly. Husbands were encouraged to speak kindly of their wives in the marketplace, to praise their cooking, to hold their hands during festivals, to donate coins to the church in her name. It wasn't about romantic passion, it was about stability. A man who neglected his wife was seen as dangerous, because a neglected wife might start talking to neighbors, to merchants, to the village priest. And once gossip began to swirl, it was very hard to recover. There are numerous examples of husbands hosting mini feasts or gifting their wives small items, a wool shawl, a sprig of lavender, a comb, which may or may not have been used. Not because they were romantic, but because the optics mattered. You had to look like a functioning household, because your household reflected on your honor. And honor was everything. Fail to meet the standards. You might end up on the receiving end of the charivari. Ah, yes, the charivari. A loud, public, humiliating event where neighbors would bang pots, sing mocking songs, and parade around your house late at night. All because your marriage seemed unbalanced. Maybe your wife bossed you around. Maybe she drank too much mead and yelled at dogs. Maybe you just weren't smiling enough during Mass. Whatever the reason, the village would show up and help. Some men tried to fight back. Others leaned into the absurdity and passed out bread to the drummers. One man even joined the charivari for his own house, claiming, "If you can't beat them, at least clap on rhythm." In the end, though, most husbands accepted their role. They plowed, they repaired roofs, they chased off thieves, they apologized for their wives' insults, and they pretended not to mind when the neighbor lady called them the quiet one with the strong elbows, because marriage for them was about duty. You were no longer just a man. You were a household, a shield, a wallet, a ladder, sometimes a pillow, sometimes a wall. And like their wives, medieval husbands found moments of meaning in shared laughter, in harvests done together, in small victories like fixing the cartwheel before it fell off in front of the bishop. So the next time you hear someone say that medieval men had it easy, remind them that some poor fellow once got fined because his wife insulted the village duck keeper and then had to wash her feet afterwards. Let's say things didn't quite go as planned. Maybe the bread was always burnt. Maybe the singing was too loud. Maybe the silence was too quiet. Maybe as the years passed, your heart quietly wandered to another place, to another life that never arrived. Maybe it just stopped beating for the person next to you. So what happens when you realize the marriage isn't working? Well, in today's world, we might talk about couples counseling, a separation, a clean break. But in medieval Europe, there was no such thing as divorce, not in the way we think of it. No lawyers, no court dates, no starting over with a new apartment and a fresh sourdough starter. Marriage was a sacrament, holy, eternal. Once the vows were made, the hands tied, and the bedding sufficiently observed, that was it. Done. Final. The church didn't believe in ending marriages. They believed in enduring them. Now, there were a few loopholes if you were determined, clever, or desperate enough. Some people went to the church and asked for an annulment. That meant saying the marriage was never valid to begin with, like trying to erase a painting by saying the canvas was never real. Maybe you were too closely related. Maybe you were too young. Maybe you never consummated the marriage, or you were pressured into it. Maybe, just maybe, you convinced the priest that you had been mentally unfit at the time of the vows. But let's be honest. The church wasn't handing these things out like warm bread. You had to really prove it. And most folks didn't have the money, the documents, or the nerve. So for the rest of the unhappy couples, they got creative. Quiet. Subtle. There was something called separation from bed and board. It wasn't a divorce. You stayed married in God's eyes, but you could live apart, sleep in different places, exist side by side, but not together. Sometimes the church allowed it, especially if things had gotten violent or cruel, or if one person had just wandered off with someone else's pig and never returned. But even that took effort. You had to tell your story, appear before someone important, maybe cry a little, or fake something bigger. And so some people faked madness. Yes, truly. They pretended to lose their minds. They spoke in riddles, walked in circles, claimed they saw saints in soup, not because they were actually broken, but because it was the only way to escape. There's a story from 14th century Italy of a woman who began dancing during Mass, loudly. She claimed an angel told her to. Her husband petitioned for separation. She quietly packed her things and went to live with her sister by the sea. And a year later, someone saw her at the market, calm, quiet, cheerful. No angels, no dancing, just peace. Other couples didn't fake madness. They just slowly vanished from each other's lives. He moved to a cousin's cottage. She took over the family bread oven. And when the priest came around, they smiled and said, "Oh, he's away on business." That business being never coming back. Of course, it wasn't always easy. The neighbors noticed. The whispers started. She sleeps alone. He hasn't been to Mass with her in weeks. And worst of all, they don't fight anymore. It's too quiet. Because in small towns, silence was suspicious. and peace was sometimes more scandalous than a public argument. Then there were the bold ones, the ones who confessed openly, "We don't love each other." And instead of pleading for separation, they simply lived as strangers in the same house. 2 beds, 2 routines, 2 hearts passing in the hallway. And they did it for decades. Maybe they found their joy elsewhere in children and goats and carving spoons. Maybe they simply endured like a river slowly wearing down the rock. But whatever the case, they stayed because staying was expected, because leaving was dangerous, because marriage wasn't about happiness. It was about structure. It was about survival. A woman who walked away from her husband might lose everything: her home, her children, her dignity. She might be accused of sorcery. A man who left his wife might lose his land, his good name, his place at the feast table. So they didn't leave, not loudly, not officially. They faded, bent, adjusted. Some even joked about it, like the husband who claimed he and his wife had become like matching chairs, sturdy, uncomfortable, and politely facing the same direction. And still, within that stillness, there were moments of rebellion, small, quiet ones. A wife who stopped mending his socks, a husband who moved the candle to the other side of the table. Little things, petty, beautiful human things. Because even in the Middle Ages, through all the laws, the rituals, the ceremonies and psalms, people still longed for choice, to be seen, to be known, to wake up next to someone who didn't just share their bed, but their laughter. And if they couldn't have that, then maybe, just maybe, they could have a separate blanket, a little peace, and a very convincing vision of St. Clement waving from the stew pot. Let's imagine you're back in your village, not a peasant this time. Let's say you're the daughter of a reasonably successful baker. The bread's crusty, the rye's dark, and people whisper that your pies are as flaky as the steward's promises. You're not royalty, you're not noble, but your family's doing all right. And like every other medieval family who's doing all right, your parents have one thing on their minds: how do we move up? Not through schooling, not through talent, not even through being extremely good at embroidery. No, you move up through marriage. Because in the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about just joining 2 people. It was about combining land influence, labor, trade routes, sheep, and sometimes tea kettles. It was a strategy. The goal was simple. Don't just marry well, marry better than you are. Let's say the family who owns the local mill has a son. He's decent. A little smug maybe, but he owns a donkey that walks in straight lines, and his uncle once visited London. That's huge. Suddenly your father's rye starts finding its way into their flour sacks. Your mother starts sending over biscuits. You start bumping into him at the well, more often even if you're not thirsty. And one evening at a feast, someone casually remarks, "Wouldn't it be something if these 2 joined houses?" And just like that, a ladder appears. Because marrying into a family with access to the mill means faster bread production. Faster bread production means more sales at market. More sales mean more silver. More silver means nicer tunics and better seats at church. And better seats at church. That means people stop calling you that bread girl and start calling you mistress of the South End oven. The same logic applied across all classes. A merchant might seek out a wife whose father had sea connections. A knight might want to marry the daughter of a well-placed steward who had access to land. A minor noble might look for a bride whose brother was studying theology because who knows, he might become a bishop. Marriage was currency, not love letters and long walks, though some of that happened later if you were lucky. It was all about negotiating your family's place in the complex chessboard of medieval life. Now, the funny thing is, people knew. No one was pretending this was a fairy tale. Everyone openly acknowledged that a good marriage meant a better life for more than just the couple. There's a story from 13th century France of a family who staged a public dinner with 3 barrels of ale and 6 varieties of cheese, just to show off their daughter's wifely hosting potential. They weren't just feeding the village, they were broadcasting their eligibility. It worked. She married the local alderman's son within the month. The cheese did the heavy lifting. In cities, it became more structured. Marriage alliances were written into business contracts. 2 spice merchants might agree that their children, currently aged 9 and 6, would wed someday, joining their pepper routes. It sounds absurd now, but it wasn't just practical, it was expected. Even poor families did it in smaller ways. A weaver might look for a family who owned a loom. A cooper might marry into a family that raised oxen because barrels need to be transported after all. And once you married up, your responsibilities changed. You had to act the part. If your husband was a minor noble, you didn't just bake bread anymore. You curated feasts. You wrote letters, hosted visiting clergy. You made sure the linen on the table matched the linen on the bishop's sleeves. Because climbing the ladder wasn't just about access, it was about maintaining the illusion that you belonged there. Sometimes people didn't. There's a rather delightful account of a pig farmer's daughter who married into a cloth merchant's family. She tried her best, learned to read, learned to sit still for more than 10 minutes, learned to wear shoes. But one day during a formal lunch, she wiped her hands on the tablecloth and shouted, "This meat's so dry it could be mistaken for confession bread." It became the talk of the town. The merchant's reputation suffered, and while no one sent her away, the next feast was a little smaller. No minstrels, just soup. Still, even with these bumps and embarrassments, people kept trying. Because every now and then it worked. You married into the right family. You inherited a cottage. You gained access to a trade guild. Your brother-in-law took you hunting with nobles. Your daughter ended up reading psalms with the mayor's wife. And your grandchildren someday would speak Latin over honeyed almonds, all because someone once married well. It wasn't just about 2 people, it was about generations. Every plate of food, every land grant, every candle at your altar, it all traced back to a wedding. A quiet moment on a stone church step, a handshake between fathers, a silk ribbon tied between hands that barely touched. So the next time someone tells you marriage is about romance, tell them the story of the baker's daughter who married the miller's son, who built the bakery by the river, whose daughter married the cooper's boy, whose son became mayor, whose portrait still hangs in the hall, next to a loaf of very old, very symbolic bread. Because in the Middle Ages, marriage didn't just change your week, it changed your legacy. Now that we've talked about marrying, well, let's talk about what happens when you don't. Not just marrying poorly, like someone who can't hold a conversation or eats turnips with their bare hands. I mean marrying outside the rules, the forbidden pairings, the frowned upon unions, the weddings that made the neighbors clutch their rosaries and whisper behind haystacks. Because in medieval society, marriage wasn't just a personal contract. It was a social statement. Who you married told the world what kind of person you were. And if that person was too different, wrong class, wrong religion, wrong village, wrong everything, then things could get complicated. Let's say you were a cobbler's son, decent job, hands always covered in wax. You fall in love with a shepherd girl, soft voice, rough hands, knows how to deliver a lamb in the dark. Sweet, right? Except she lives 2 hills over. She's from a family that no one in your village talks to anymore. Something about a feud over a poisoned well, 3 goats, and a broken fence post. You marry her anyway. At first, nothing happens. You're in love. You build a life. You fix boots while she tends sheep and tells you which ones are having emotional crises. But slowly, quietly, the village shifts. The baker forgets your order. The priest avoids your house during blessing rounds. At the next festival, there's no seat for you. At the long table, not even next to the guy who smells like pickled eels. Because by marrying her, you didn't just choose a person, you chose a side. You brought old stories back to life. You reopened wounds people had buried under barley and boredom. Sometimes it wasn't about feuds, sometimes it was class. A peasant who married a tradesman might find themselves caught in a strange in-between world, not low enough to be welcomed by the field workers, not high enough to be invited to the merchant guild dances, like being permanently stuck at the side table, where the ale is flat. And someone keeps talking about poultry diseases. There are stories, real ones, of couples who were literally banished for marrying wrong. One young man in Normandy married a girl from a nearby fishing village. She was lovely. She also happened to be the daughter of a woman who had once been accused of fortune-telling and refused to apologize. When they returned home after the wedding, they found their door blocked with brambles. A note pinned to the lintel read, "The tide brings in many things. Not all should stay." They ended up living in a shack near the edge of a marsh, raising ducks and never speaking above a whisper. In some towns, the punishment was more creative. One couple in the English Midlands, he, a butcher's apprentice, she, the illegitimate child of a former priest, were ordered to tend the onion fields for 5 years, every day, knees deep in dirt, no payment, just onions. By the end of the first season, they were called the allium couple. They didn't seem to mind. They had matching cloaks and the best soup in town. Then there were interfaith marriages, rare, risky, and often tragic. A Christian man who married a Jewish woman, or vice versa, was stepping directly into the fire. Even if love was real, even if the families somehow agreed, the community rarely did. They might not be physically harmed, but they were often erased, names removed from rolls, stalls taken away at market, doors that were once open suddenly closed. And yet people still did it, because human hearts, even in the Middle Ages, are stubborn things. There's one story from a coastal village in Sicily about a Muslim sailor and a Christian baker's daughter. They met during a storm. She gave him bread, he gave her dried figs, and somewhere between food and thunder, they decided to share a life. They built a small home out of driftwood and shells. They lived quietly, baked beautifully, and were left mostly alone, except during feast days, when some kind soul would quietly leave them extra flour tucked into a sack labeled blessings. Not every story ended that softly. There were stories of exile, of lovers who disappeared, of one partner being forced to return home while the other was left behind to raise children under constant suspicion. But even in those stories, even in the sadness, there's something brave, something tender, a willingness to say, this is the person I choose, even if it costs me everything I once knew. Because in the end, marriage outside the law wasn't just a rebellion, it was a declaration, a way of saying I see the rules, I understand the ladder, but I'm not climbing it today. And sometimes in a world so obsessed with hierarchy and reputation, that little act of defiance of love anyway was more powerful than 100 feasts with the bishop. So yes, they were punished, made to weed fields or feed ducks or live near the edge of the map, but they also made new stories, new soups, new dances no one else knew. And that maybe was enough. Let's take a little detour now, away from the politics, away from the punishments, away from the priests holding candles and the dowries wrapped in linen. Let's step into something sillier, because for all the seriousness of medieval marriage, the contracts, the alliances, the whispered vows and shared shame, sometimes people just wanted to have a little fun with it. And so they did something delightfully absurd. They held mock weddings. Yes, real celebrations, fake marriages, no legal binding, no church approval, just joy costumes, food, and laughter. It usually happened during festivals, especially springtime ones like May Day or midsummer fairs. The air smelled like blooming elderflower and roasted barley. People danced barefoot on the green. The ale was flowing, and so was the imagination. In these festivals, entire villages would gather to crown a May Queen and May King. Not actual royalty, just the most popular girl and boy of the season, or the prettiest, or the funniest, or the ones with the best singing voices. And once crowned, what came next? A wedding, of course. A pretend one, sometimes announced by the town fool with a wooden trumpet, sometimes planned in secret and revealed mid-feast. The couple would walk hand in hand to the center of the square. Someone would act as priest, another would play music badly on a whistle, and the rest, they'd cheer, throw petals, offer little gifts like carrots, pebbles, or love poems that made absolutely no sense. There were no rules. One year, the May Queen married a scarecrow. Another year, two milkmaids married each other and spent the evening holding hands and daring people to bring them cheese. No one stopped it, because everyone understood. This wasn't rebellion, it wasn't scandal, it was play. In a world that was often hard, muddy, hierarchical, and deeply concerned with who sat where and why. These mock weddings were a chance to breathe, to laugh, to pretend just for a little while that love could be light and ridiculous and entirely made up. People got into it. They made crowns from dandelions. They painted rings on their fingers with berry juice. They invented absurd vows like, I promise to always share my stew and never steal your socks without asking. The ceremony might be followed by a honeymoon, which meant sitting on a log together while other villagers fanned them with cabbage leaves and sang off-key lullabies. Sometimes they had a pretend argument halfway through the night just to stay in character. One woman was famously heard shouting, You told me you owned 3 pigs, but they were just shadows in the fog. The crowd applauded. Not every mock wedding was between sweethearts. Some were between people who barely spoke. Some were between rivals. Some between best friends. And occasionally, someone got married to a tree. In one coastal village, the bride of a spring festival chose the oldest tree in the forest as her husband. She walked to it barefoot, sang a song about sap, and then tied herself to the trunk with red ribbons. For weeks after people left offerings at the base of the tree, the bark apparently smelled sweeter that year. Of course, not everyone approved. There were always a few elders muttering that this kind of thing mocked the sanctity of the sacrament. But even the priest usually smiled, because everyone knew it was make-believe. And sometimes make-believe was the safest way to imagine something better. What's especially lovely is that sometimes these fake marriages led to real ones. Two people would joke their way through the night, laughing in front of friends and family, tying pretend knots and tossing flower petals. And in the weeks that followed, they'd start to walk home together, start to talk a little longer near the well, start to notice how kind the other looked when peeling onions. And months later, they'd be back on the church steps, but this time with real linen and real rings and slightly less cabbage. Other times, the mock wedding ended when the ale ran out, or when the husband got distracted by a wandering goat, or when the wife challenged 3 men to a drinking contest and forgot her own name, because that was the beauty of it. It wasn't supposed to last. It was temporary joy, shared silliness, a reminder that even in a world so weighed down by expectations and duty, people could still come together and say, let's play pretend. Let's act like love is simple. Let's laugh like children and crown each other kings for the night. And maybe that's why those mock weddings stayed in people's memories longer than some of the real ones, because no dowry was exchanged, no feast was measured, no relatives fought over who brought the wrong stew. Just music, just dancing, just a couple of fools in flower crowns saying, "For tonight I choose you." And tomorrow, well, that was a problem for future love. After all the contracts, all the dowries, all the goat's gloves and strategic unions, after the feasts and the foot washing and the awkward nights under scratchy wool, you might be wondering something simple, something human. Was there ever love? And the answer is yes, but not always in the way you'd expect. Love, real love, the kind that slips between the cracks, that takes root quietly. It did exist in medieval marriages. It just had to grow in some very strange soil. Sometimes it came later. A marriage would begin like most others, arranged, practical, politely distant. 2 strangers told they now belonged to each other. They'd share a roof, a meal, a silence, and over time, they'd begin to know each other. He'd learn that she liked her bread crust slightly burnt. She'd learn that he hummed when he tied bundles of wood. They'd share a look across the table when someone told the same story for the 3rd time. They'd laugh quietly when the chickens escaped again. And somewhere between repairing thatched roofs and surviving another winter, a kind of love would start to settle. Not the kind that sweeps you off your feet, the kind that keeps your feet on the ground when everything else feels unsteady. There are letters, real ones, written by medieval husbands and wives that speak in soft, clumsy poetry. Not grand declarations, but quiet lines like, "I miss your soup. My bed is colder without you. The children have your smile, and it comforts me." Not everyone was so lucky. There were plenty of marriages filled with cold stares, duty, and nothing more than shared fatigue. People who lived together like shadows, passing across the same wall. But even then, love sometimes crept in, from the side, between a servant and the master's son, between a widow and the priest who taught her to read, between 2 old friends who found themselves married off to other people and still met at the river to talk about dreams they never told anyone else. Then there were the rare, flickering exceptions, the stories that survived because they were unusual, like the knight who fell in love with the daughter of a potter. He gave up his claim to land. She brought nothing but her laughter and a beautiful singing voice. They opened a small inn. They wrote their own vows secretly and whispered them every year on the night of their wedding. Or the woman who married a much older merchant not for his money, but because he once helped her carry a wounded dog home during a storm. They raised the dog. They raised 4 children. They grew old and soft around the edges. And in his will, he left her not just land and silver, but a small box filled with the feathers she used to tuck into his shoes each winter. Even in court records, those dry, dusty pages, there are hints. A man petitioning for mercy, explaining that he stole a loaf of bread not for himself, but for the woman who waits at home, who has never asked for much. There's love in that. Not grand, not legendary, but steady. Sometimes love came after tragedy. A woman widowed young, remarried not by force, but by quiet agreement. She and her second husband would sit together in the evenings, not speaking much. But when she coughed, he always passed her the warm drink first. When he limped, she walked slower. And that, in its own quiet way, was love too. The truth is, love in the Middle Ages had to hide itself. It wasn't the focus, it wasn't the goal, but it found a way to sneak in through shared blankets, shared work, shared glances when the world turned its back. Even in the hardest marriages when love wasn't there, people dreamed of it. They wrote poems, they whispered stories. They carved hearts into tree trunks. They fed birds at the same hour every morning, hoping someone else might be doing the same across the valley. Because love, even when not expected, still lived in people's bones. In the quiet ache, in the gentle reaching, in the hope that even in a world of arranged unions and legal bindings, someone might still choose you. Not for your dowry, not for your father's connections, but for the way you said their name, the way you touched their hand before lighting the candle, the way you remembered which bread they liked. So yes, there was love, not always easy, not always visible, but real, worn in, held gently like something fragile and too important to say out loud. Let's take a moment now, not to talk about marriage, but about what happened when you didn't marry at all. Because in medieval society there was something almost unnatural about a woman who lived alone. No husband, no children, just herself, and maybe a cat. It didn't matter how kind she was, how well she kept her home, how often she prayed, or how generously she shared her bread. If she didn't marry by a certain age, let's say her early 20s, people started to whisper. They used a word, a soft one, a loaded one. Spinster. It didn't mean woman who spins, though. That's where it came from. It meant woman who didn't fit, didn't belong to a man, didn't serve a household, didn't fold neatly into the structure of things. At first it might be subtle, a missed invitation, a priest who avoids eye contact during the blessing, neighbors who forget to mention the harvest festival. But over time it grew louder. People would say, "She's strange. She walks alone in the woods. She talks to birds, or worse, herbs. She hasn't cried once since her father died." Not once. It didn't take much. A woman who didn't marry was seen as suspicious, like she knew something the rest of the village didn't, or didn't want to share something she was supposed to. Because a wife could be controlled, a mother could be understood, but a woman with no ties, she became a question that no one liked the answer to. Some of these women were healers. They knew which leaves to boil for fever, which roots eased pain, which flowers kept away insects and grief. And at first the village needed them. They'd come in secret, ask for a salve, beg for a tea, bring eggs in exchange for something that helped the baby sleep. But when something went wrong, when a child didn't survive the winter or a cow gave sour milk, the blame had to go somewhere, and it often landed at the doorstep of the unmarried woman with the quiet voice and the shelf full of dried herbs. She was a witch, they said. Not loudly, not at first, but enough. And that cat, the one she spoke to like a friend, the one who followed her through fields and purred in her lap, clearly a familiar, a demon in disguise, or at the very least a bad omen in a fur coat. There's a story from a small village in Yorkshire about a woman named Agnes. She was never married. She lived in a stone cottage on the edge of the woods. She was known for her apple tarts and her knowledge of the moon's behavior. And then one year a strange sickness swept through. Not many died, but enough to make people afraid. Someone mentioned that Agnes's cat had been seen sleeping on the windowsill of a sick child's house. The next morning there were stones thrown at her door. The morning after that her cat was gone. No one could prove anything. No one said anything directly. But she wasn't seen at church again. And when she passed away quietly that winter, the priest delayed her burial for 3 days, just in case. Of course, not every unmarried woman was accused of witchcraft. Some were simply pitied. People said things like, "Poor thing. She never had a suitor. She was too proud. Her dowry was too small. She laughed too loud. She read too much." Because in their eyes, there had to be a reason. A woman alone could not simply choose to stay that way. She had to be broken, or shamed, or strange. But here's the secret no one liked to say out loud. Some of these women were happy. They had their own routines. They kept gardens. They wrote little poems in the margins of prayer books. They taught neighborhood children how to read. They carved spoons, baked bread, whispered to birds, and fell asleep without fear of being told they were too much or too little. And yes, they were lonely sometimes. But so were many wives lying beside husbands who never spoke, or listening to snoring instead of affection. The difference was, these women had chosen their solitude. And in a world where women were expected to be possessions to be passed, promised, and paid for choosing anything at all, was a radical act. They weren't saints, they weren't rebels, they were just people, making their way through a society that didn't know what to do with women who weren't wives or widows. And perhaps that's why they made people nervous. Because deep down, even in the most obedient household, even in the most respectable marriage, someone might look at the spinster in her cottage and wonder, what would it be like to wake up when you want to eat soup for breakfast, to pet a cat who never judges, and to grow old in peace? And now, after all the ceremonies and silences, after the dowries and dances and dreams that whispered through straw walls, we return to where we began, to marriage, not as a celebration, not as a punishment, but as a key, a small quiet key that unlocked everything else in medieval life. Because who you married, it shaped your world. It decided where you sat in church, what table you ate at during festivals, whether your children could go to school or had to plow fields before sunrise. It even decided which corner of the cemetery you'd be buried in someday. Marry well, and doors opened, a new piece of land, a better roof, a cousin in the guild who helped your son become an apprentice instead of a laborer, a friend in the clergy who whispered your name during prayer. Marry poorly or not at all, and those doors closed, sometimes gently, sometimes loud enough for the whole village to hear. Marriage was never just about two people. It was about networks, ties, threads in a vast, messy web of bread, blood, belief, and barley. Even your seat at a funeral might depend on who your spouse was. There are records, real ones, of people being moved to the back of the churchyard because their husband was of uncertain parentage or their wife had once yelled at a merchant during Lent. It sounds ridiculous now. But then again, so does judging someone today by what car they drive or which side of town they live on. Every age has its ladders, its codes, its silent rules no one explains, but everyone learns. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't a personal choice. It was a social navigation system. You used it to survive, to stabilize, to step a little closer to the hearth instead of freezing near the barn door. And yet, even within all that structure, there was still space for something softer, for small glances, for shared jokes over burnt stew, for holding hands in the dark while the children sleep and the wind howls at the shutters. Even the most calculated marriage tied together by ambition and land might with time gather tenderness like moss on old stone. So yes, marriage shaped your entire social life, but it also made space for human life, for ordinary, awkward, beautiful companionship, for learning to like the way someone stirs porridge, for forgiveness, for bread shared quietly after a long day. And perhaps that's the strangest thing of all, that even in a world where everything seemed fixed and measured and approved by a man in a robe with ink-stained fingers, people still found love anyway. Or if not love, then warmth, kindness, shared weight, and maybe that's enough. So tonight, wherever you are, whether you're curled under a modern duvet or listening in a room lit only by phone glow, know this: your worth isn't tied to who you marry. Not anymore. You don't need a dowry or a ban or approval from your neighbors. You just need rest. A quiet moment, a soft place to land, and maybe a cat